On a freezing night in Chicago, a billionaire's daughter was just one step away from death. But the man who saved her was a forgotten soldier the world had left behind. The winter wind howled through the streets of Chicago, biting against faces and freezing fingertips. On a bench outside a luxury restaurant, an old man sat wrapped in a tattered army jacket. His beard was long, his boots cracked, and his hands trembling from both the cold and hunger. Few gave him a glance. Even fewer gave him respect. His name was James Carter, a decorated veteran of the U.S. Marines who once wore his uniform with pride. Now he was invisible. Inside the restaurant, warmth and laughter flowed. Tonight was the 16th birthday of Emily Lawson, daughter of Edward Lawson, the billionaire tech mogul behind Lawson Enterprises. Cameras waited outside. This was no ordinary party. It was a spectacle, a display of wealth. Edward wanted everything to be perfect for his only child, especially since his wife's death 5 years earlier had left a permanent shadow on their home. Emily, though, wasn't enjoying the show. She slipped out through a side door to breathe, tugging her dress against the freezing air. She hated being the center of attention, hated the whispers that she was spoiled and untouchable. In truth, she felt trapped in a golden cage. And that was when it happened. A sudden screech of tires, a drunk driver swerving down the icy street. Emily froze in terror as the headlights bore down on her. Then, impact never came. Instead, strong arms yanked her backwards. She fell hard onto the pavement, breath stolen, heart racing. The car sped away into the night. When she looked up, the man who had pulled her to safety was kneeling beside her, his beard frosted, his jacket threadbare, but his eyes steady. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice hoarse. Emily blinked. You saved me." James just shrugged. "Reflex. Old habits die hard inside." Chaos erupted. Edward Lawson stormed out with security. When he saw his daughter on the ground beside a filthy homeless man, his fury boiled over. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Emily stood quickly. "Dad, he saved my life." A car almost... Edward cut her off. "Get away from my daughter." His voice was ice, but Emily didn't move. "No!" He pulled me out of the street. "If not for him, I'd..." "Enough!" Edward snapped. He turned to James. "Security, remove this man immediately." The guards stepped forward. James didn't resist. He was used to being pushed aside. But as they dragged him away, Emily shouted, "Dad, you can't just throw him out." "He's a hero." Edward froze. That word, hero. Later that night, when the party had ended and the cameras were gone, Emily refused to speak to her father. She locked herself in her room, leaving Edward pacing the mansion halls. He couldn't shake the image of that man's eyes. Calm, disciplined, unmistakably military. And the word his daughter had spoken echoed in his mind. Hero. The next morning, Edward made some calls. Within hours, he had James Carter's entire file: Iraq, Afghanistan, 3 tours, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Then, an honorable discharge followed by years of silence. No family, no home. Just a downward spiral until he disappeared into the streets. For the first time in decades, Edward Lawson, a man who thought money could solve anything, felt shame. 2 days later, James sat in a shelter when 2 men in suits approached. "Mr. Carter," one said. "Mr. Lawson would like a word." James narrowed his eyes. "Pretty sure he wanted me thrown out last time." "Please," the man insisted. Reluctantly, James followed them to Lawson Tower, a skyscraper of glass and steel that touched the clouds. Inside the billionaire's office, the contrast between their worlds was overwhelming. Polished marble floors against James's scuffed boots. Edward stood. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology, and my daughter owes you her life." James said nothing. He had faced generals, bombs, and fire. A billionaire's apology meant little. Edward continued, "I want to offer you something. A home, a job, security." James shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? I didn't save Emily for a reward. I saved her because it was the right thing to do." Emily, who had insisted on being there, stepped forward. "Dad, maybe he doesn't need charity. Maybe he needs respect." The silence was sharp. Over the following weeks, Emily visited James at the shelter. She listened to his stories of battle, of brothers lost, of promises broken when they came home. She invited him to the mansion over Edward's objections. Slowly, James began to laugh again, to tell stories not just of war, but of life, of jazz clubs in New Orleans, of fishing trips in Michigan, of the world before it all crumbled. Edward watched uneasily, but when one evening he saw Emily smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years, something cracked in his chest. He realized James had given his daughter what all his money could not, a sense of grounding, of connection. Months later, Edward Lawson stood at a press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. But instead of announcing another billion-dollar deal, he stunned everyone. Today, Lawson Enterprises is committing $200 million to launch the Carter Foundation, named after a man who reminded me of the meaning of honor. This foundation will build transitional housing and rehabilitation programs for homeless veterans across America. Gasps filled the room. At Edward's side, James shifted uncomfortably in his new suit, still not used to the spotlight. Emily squeezed his hand. One reporter called out, "Mr. Lawson, why the sudden change of heart?" Edward glanced at his daughter, then at James. His voice, usually polished and commanding, trembled just slightly. "Because for the first time, I realized I wasn't the richest man in the room. I was the poorest until I met someone who taught me what wealth really means." A year later, the first Carter House opened in Chicago. Veterans lined up at its doors not for charity, but for dignity. Inside, James Carter served as director, helping others rebuild their lives step by step. Emily volunteered weekly, learning not about coding or finance, but about resilience, sacrifice, and leadership. And Edward? He attended quietly. No cameras, no speeches. Just a father finally learning from a man who had nothing and gave everything. Because in the end, true power wasn't measured in dollars or buildings. It was measured in the lives you chose to honor. And the homeless veteran who once sat invisible on a frozen bench had, without realizing it, saved not just a billionaire's daughter, but the billionaire himself.